Hello, listeners, and welcome to Privacy Chats with Rachel and John, a forum for John and I to discuss topics, issues, and ideas that interest us related to privacy. We're both experienced and certified privacy professionals that created this show in order to educate each other and our audience about privacy-related topics that we learn about through our own research and from our own experiences. Before we begin the episode, I'd like to offer a quick disclaimer regarding the content shared on our show. As privacy professionals, the topics John and I discuss, as well as the opinions we share, are entirely of our own and not representative in any way of our employers. We research and share content that is publicly available and will therefore not include any trade secrets or other information which is confidential in nature. Thanks again for tuning in, and let's get on to the episode. Right. The desire for this episode is to take a step back and kind of talk about it somewhat in layman's terms, but really nothing that's based too much in I don't want to say research or fact, but like talking about it pretty casually as if we're just, we found someone on the street and we're like, what do you think about privacy? But between us.
Yeah, got it.
So our, questions will be along the lines of why is privacy such a complex topic? What does it mean to us personally? Where do we fall on kind of the risk tolerance scale for privacy in our personal lives? And then how we got into the field.
So my favorite description of privacy actually goes back a long way, and it's something that we've talked about before. Is an article that a couple of like famous guys back in the privacy world in the like 1800s wrote something, and their definition was that privacy is the right to be left alone, which I think is really cool and succinct. And privacy is in the Constitution, the Fourth Amendment. So like it doesn't actually say privacy, but the right to be protected against unreasonable search and seizure. But I think it gets complex because people don't actually want to be left alone. It's a really interconnected world, and people want to have Amazon accounts and Netflix accounts, and we have to have bank accounts for our rent and mortgage and stuff like that. And so we want to live in an interconnected world. So that makes privacy really more complex, of us trying to figure out how to protect information about ourselves, but still have it out there, because I still want Amazon packages to show up, and I need to see the next episode of Ted Lasso.
I want to buy things. I want to view things.
What was that?
I said, you want to buy things, you want to view things, you want to interact with things. Like
that's,
it's required to make it happen now, is sharing information.
For sure. So what's your definition of privacy? Like, what's your outlook on it?
I personally like the one that's centered around the right to be left alone. I also think about it in the terms of the right not to be observed. Since, to your point, like so much of our daily lives involve sharing information with others or kind of being observed, so to speak, in the background. I think the observation piece makes it a bit more broad to not just say left alone, because I don't feel like maybe I'm immediately being intruded at all times, but that's just a facet of it being in the digital space, and that observation being a bit more obscured in a lot of cases than something more like obvious as someone peering into my window. So I like, the idea of being able to control how you're observed. I also recognize that like privacy and it's essential for social boundaries. And we've recognized that for a pretty long time as a society. So it's like having both a freedom of expression, but also having the right not to need to be expressed or being observed as expressing oneself. So I think privacy kind of goes hand in hand with that freedom of expression, almost being the inverse right, or the inverse case. And like you said, like we all want to share stuff. We need to share stuff, like our banking information to make transactions. But I think it's really interesting because of how many different actors are involved in the privacy equation. Like to your point, you have corporations and entities we want to transact with. You have the government that's interested in what everyone's doing all the time, just trying to balance how much of that they can get against social norms. And then you have like everyone else. You have your friends and family that you share information with, or, the classic hackers and, bad actors that are trying to sweep between these interactions with you and corporations, you and your friends, you and the government at times. So it's just there's a lot of people involved in this, like, what is privacy question, that's
Hmm.
supposed to be incorporated by that very short, the right to be left alone statement, that I think it's hard to encompass into one very precise definition always.
It is hard, and I think some of our conversation now is going to get into some of that complexity of it, because I think people are fickle sometimes. Like they'll say stuff, but then what they do is different than that. And even when you talk about the government, and there's some people think about the government as this big looming entity that wants to know everything about all of our lives, and I'm just pondering here because I don't know the answers to this, but I don't know that there really is a the government, because the government is really just a collection of agencies that do different things. And I'm pretty sure that they have rules about what information they share among agencies and why, and processes for doing that. And we know darn well if they're violating those procedures and practices and rules, there's whistleblowers that tell on them.
Right.
So I wonder how much we should be worried about the government, because I don't see that there is the government. Like, you might be worried about the
Yeah,
the
not
IRS
one big
having too much
storm cloud.
information about you, or yeah.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the well, not go back. So taking it one step farther, I guess. So why should this matter to you, or did you have a particular privacy awakening moment, or what's your story? Like, where do you come from the privacy perspective?
Yeah, I'll work backwards off of our research for this podcast, honestly, because
Okay.
the fact that it's a human right, which it wasn't a huge surprise to me, but of course it's something I learned through our research in episode 2, that it is blatantly there in the UN's United Declarations of Human Rights.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty solid reason in and of itself. Like, the
Sure.
world's largest and most interconnected countries all agree, hey, this is something all of our citizens should have regardless of where you reside.
Yeah.
I think being in this generation that fully grew up in the digital age, I'm in a weird spot where I can see how the lines are being blurred, like, consistently over time, but where those lines began, and kind of experiencing the predecessors of the technology that allows us to do what we do today with exchanging, personal information with our friends and family, or, like we said
Yeah.
earlier, transactional information, just to make it easy to buy stuff and tell other people stuff and exchange information, right?
Yeah.
I don't have the same, like, lens of contrast between what happened 20 years ago and what being an adult was like then, and compared to where it is now. But I do recognize the necessity of it, because we're already here. We're already in a place
Yeah.
where most of, the means of exchange and production stuff exists to some extent on an online platform.
Yeah.
And at least my education, I was aware enough of how that can be used for commercial purposes, as well as how it just works fundamentally in the background. Speaking to my education a little bit more, in my second or third year of undergrad, I did have sort of
Okay.
this wake up story. And that was when I was sitting in my big data, my data mining class. I had a whole class
Okay.
on this. And it was a pretty new program in and of itself. And the professor had started the course, or the first class of the course, asking us just to simply open up our phones and poke around in some
Okay.
of our privacy and security settings. And he took us all the
Sure.
way to what at the time was, I think, something like the frequent locations or the significant locations tab. They might still have it. I just haven't looked at it in a long time.
Yeah.
And at least at the time, I remember for sure, and I didn't love this. When I opened that page, it wasn't turned off by default, meaning, like, my significant locations were being tracked by Apple,
Yeah.
in my settings app in my background. So that was my first little, like, okay, this is creepy how this is happening. I wasn't surprised, of course, but I'm like, hey, it was that feeling of, like, hey, no one told me this was going on. No one
Yeah.
told me that you could see every location that my phone's pinged in the last day, or I can't remember, week, even further than that.
Yeah.
It was cool. Like, technically, I was nerding out about it, and that was part of the reason that he introduced it, was in two aspects, saying, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on in the background of consumer devices that we don't know
Yeah.
about. Now the relationship with data mining is that like there's a lot of power in knowing that, knowing how to manipulate that,
Yeah.
and even adding new ways to track things like metadata that you don't think are important until they inform patterns about how
Yeah.
humans behave and transact and interact with one another, which is an extremely valuable commodity in the information economy now. So that being the purpose for the whole class was like a double-ended sword that woke me up to go, oh look, I didn't even know this was going on. What else don't I know is going on, so to speak, with
Yeah.
tracking?
And that raises a really important point about privacy is you really should know what's going on with the data that's there. And I'm not saying that we should trust Apple. So if anyone takes that from what I'm about to say, please don't. But the reality is, like, who really has access to that data on your phone, and what are they using it for? I think we're pretty sure that if Apple can monetize it, they are to sell ads or something like that. But on the flip side of that, I don't know. I don't have any specific examples, but I suspect that there have been some pretty serious crimes that have been solved using location data on people's phones. So, it goes back to your point about it being a double-edged sword. That data has been used for good, I suspect, and we know darn well it's being used for bad. But yeah, you should have awareness about what's going on. So
Yeah,
I'm
at the
curious to look. I've
minimum.
seen
And
those
then you
settings. I
can
haven't
make
looked
an
at them for a
informed
while.
choice about, if there are settings to turn things off or services to use.
Yeah.
But I guess, how about you in a more formal manner? Like, why does privacy matter to John from your perspective, man?
So so there's two parts of this question, and I don't know why this case really resonates with me, I guess. But so I worked for a school of public health at a university here in Maryland a few years ago, and I was very involved with the research committee and the research that they did, and reviewing some of the research plans to make sure that they were compliant with, there's a couple of different laws out there for research, particularly when you're involving human subjects. And there was a case that I became aware of. It was a university in Arizona. The case was the Arizona Board of Regents versus the Havasupai. I hope I'm saying that right. But
That
it was a
sounds right.
tribe, a Native American tribe in Arizona. And what happened with them, I guess that tribe was having a disproportionate number of cases of people with diabetes. And this university was going to do some research starting around 1990. And they took blood samples with consent from members of the tribe to do some research into diabetes. But then they took the blood samples, and without consent, they used the blood samples to do other studies on mental illness and genealogy and other things. And one of the things that they found in this research that they did without consent was that this tribe had really originated in a different part of the world and had migrated into and ended up in Arizona. But the fundamental beliefs of the tribe were that they had always lived like in this tribal land was theirs and it always had been. Um, and the point is that's not right. When you're going to tell somebody that you're going to use their data or their blood samples in this case for one thing, and then use it for something else that is contrary to the beliefs of the tribe in this case, is just wrong. And that when I came across, I had nothing to do with the case, but when I read about it, I was interested in it and realized that that's wrong, and that's something that we do with privacy. On a personal level, I still have free, I guess, credit monitoring or something, because my data was involved in the U.S. government, the Office of Management and Budget. There was a big breach in 2014, 2015.
Hmm.
And there were 22 million records were breached. And what's interesting to me about that breach was only just over 4 million of the records were for government employees. And the reason they had my records was evidently I had applied for a job through USA Jobs or something. And they retained those records and it got breached. And so my information is out there for, I guess, whatever hackers want to buy it. Um, and it's not like, that's not right. I don't like, I haven't really been harmed by it. But you somewhat feel violated when you know that information about you is out there in the hands of people that you didn't intend for them to have it, and I don't know. it's just not right.
Yeah,
So that's my.
it kind of addresses the two of the, I got three actors I mentioned in the last question, where you have the government that's
The,
maintaining, sensitive information about their employees and those that aren't employees. And then you have your bad actors that are aware of this exchange of information that have interest in capturing that to do God knows what with, probably to make money, to your point, off of with.
yeah.
So that's a fair reason to have experienced a annoying data breach at the minimum, and like, I think it's fascinating how much that instance could be extrapolated over all of the apps that we use in our day to day life. Like, I have to have at least, honestly, 50 on my phone that have my information to some extent because they're on my phone.
Right.
And I can only imagine what happens if, in the worst case, not likely scenario, but that every single one gets breached. Like, what else do I have? What else am I if all of my information is just out there for the taking, even if I didn't want to?
And not even for the taking. It's out there because you're giving it to them.
Yeah.
And I'll ask you, you cited having 50 apps on there. So have you read 50 privacy statements or privacy notices
Yeah,
for those apps? No,
some
none of us have.
statistics say that's like a year long of reading where I'm just not
Right.
sleeping, not eating, just taped eyeballs open, like reading the TNCs that are
Yeah.
legalese anyway.
Yeah. Which is a problem. This goes back to what I said. You really need to know what's happening with your information. And in this case, we don't, because the terms and conditions or the privacy notices are too long and complex and boring. It's legalese that we don't like. We're
Yeah.
just not going to do it.
Yeah. And it's interesting you bring that up, because one of our other prompts was, why is privacy even such a complex topic to begin with? Sounds pretty straightforward when you think of both of our definitions being a one sentence definition, right? But there's always this, I don't know, this like hesitation or break when I talk about privacy to those that aren't like in the field. They're like, I don't
Yeah.
really know what that means or what you do or anything. It's kind of an enigma to me, right? Like, why do you think we get that response?
Well, I think it's because going back to people just don't understand it, and nor well, I guess they should, but their actions contradict their words. Like they'll say that I don't want anyone to have my data, but then as soon as they're given the opportunity to, like, if you I don't know, fill in this form with your email address, you're in a raffle to win this free car. You're not going to win the free car. Like all they're doing is offering you a free car because they want your email address, and not
The
that.
very small chance for a free
Right,
car.
exactly. So people, I think it's the in our industry we call it the privacy paradox, that
Mm.
people value privacy and say all kinds of things about protecting their privacy and their information, but then they freely give it up when it's convenient. And I think the number one method of cybersecurity attack is social engineering, and it's just tricking people to giving up their information. So, and even like one of the big privacy laws in the United States, since the privacy laws here are sectoral instead of comprehensive, not to go too deep into it, but one of the big sectoral laws is HIPAA. But you'll hear people citing HIPAA, like if somebody, I don't know, two people are talking to each other on the sideline of a football game, for example, and somebody will say something about somebody else's health condition or something, and they're like, that's a HIPAA violation. Okay, it's not a HIPAA violation. HIPAA is very specific to what they call covered entities. So unless you're a doctor's office or a health insurance company, you have no obligations to HIPAA
Right. It's not this
whatsoever.
magic wand
Um,
of, hey, don't do that. Pew.
yes, I mean, I guess you could be impressed that people are aware that HIPAA has something to do with health privacy.
Mm.
But it's not the panacea for protecting all of your health information at all. And I don't think there's much of a problem, probably because of HIPAA. That people's medical information is fairly well protected by the healthcare industry. Maybe we need to get to a place where the same is true for personal information outside of the healthcare industry, and I think that we're probably heading there. Uh, but yeah, so that's my simple answer is that it's complex because people are fickle about it. They
Mm.
say that they value it, but then they don't in their actions. What
Yeah.
are your thoughts?
When I answered this question as a prompt. I actually took a different response, but I did recognize that, it's a difficult place to start because everyone's personal definition of privacy in their brain or their subconscious is a little bit different.
Yeah.
Depending on their like exposure to different harms. Like I'm sure it's very different if you've suffered the consequences of, say, a data breach. That might kind of whip you into this, crap. Like I have all these other areas of information that I don't have 2FA on, or if I have a crappy password. You have that wake up moment. But if you haven't really experienced those harms and you're not, then this is totally understandable. Like particularly tech savvy, where you can actually internalize what could possibly be scraped in the background and what it's used for in all of your devices and in apps that you do on a daily basis. Like it's hard to get people on board and aware. And when I answered the question, going back to it itself, why is it such a complex topic? I say I took a different approach from you because I feel like more people than not that I encounter on a day-to-day basis, and this could just be a factor of my generation and my surrounding, my peers being in that generation too, is that
Sure.
the sentiment is like, I have nothing to hide. Like Gen Z or my peers tend to be pretty aware of like the evils of big tech and the evils of, the whole data transaction, like the data brokering industry, but they just frankly claim that they don't care. They're just like, whatever, they have it anyway. If I have a smartphone, I assume that everything I'm doing is being watched, blah, blah, blah. And it's
Yeah.
taken from this, like, it's talked about from this kind of complacent space and attitude of like, what more could go wrong at this point? Like, why should I care if it's happening anyway? And I feel like it's defeatist. I'm a little bit biased here because it's just something I think about and I'm aware of a lot, privacy in general.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting that we have the attitude because despite the fact that we grew up in an online environment a little bit and we were told, hey, everything you do online is permanent and like, be careful what you do online. Yet then we see, 15, 20, 25 years later, like there's this conflict because you're seeing everyone share everything and post everything online anyway. So a lot to go all the way back around and say I face the opposite attitude more. And I feel like it's more complex on that end because you're trying to get people out of that defeatist attitude and go, hey, like there's still things you can do to control this. And we're not just talking about the evils of, corporations that have been put in the surveillance capitalism type category that is, something you can be aware of if you feel like that's creepy or you want to make
Yeah.
sure that these companies are doing the right thing with what you provision them with. But it's not the only factor. Like you still have the possibilities of things like cyber stalking. And, if you're not technically savvy and you end up, say, in an abusive relationship and you don't know how that person can like withhold
Yeah.
your access or, snoop on you in some ways, like that's a problem because that's part of your autonomy and your own personal right to have control over the things you do. And a lot of that can be made harder and more difficult when you're putting so much of that control onto technology that you don't understand what the possibilities
Yeah.
are behind. So that's why I think it's such a complex topic. That plus the fact that these things are hard to observe. So sometimes they're not physically tangible. Like my device fingerprint, like if I say that to the
Yeah.
average person, they're not going to know what that means. Like, so how do I expect them to care who has it or when it's obtained and what it's used for? So that intangibility component, I think, also exacerbates that for the less technically savvy folks.
Yeah, it's an interesting, and I like the fact that you put it as kind of a generational thing, and certainly people of older generations come at this from a different perspective. Um, but that, yeah, and it makes sense the way you describe it. And really, as privacy practitioners, we really have to meet society where they are and not expect them to come to where we are because they're the people that we are here to serve. So we need to understand what their perspective is and meet them there.
Absolutely
So
agree. I think the other bit of it too is that like having grown up in an online environment basically in my generation means that there
sure,
was never a checkpoint to say, oh, like I shouldn't be sharing everything about my surroundings in my house and like what I'm doing every other day on social media.
yeah,
I have more friends that just seem to tag themselves wherever they move to the next location, and there's no problem with it. And they're completely open in public. Some may even be influencers, where it's basically your brand to be public.
Yeah.
And so I sometimes question how much that's influenced the narrative, because if, say, I'm talking about privacy to someone in that camp, there's already this likely perception that, the way they live their life online and the way that they share information is inherently being threatened by the fact that I'm questioning, whether that's good for safety, it's good for, kind of safeguarding your own risk there.
Yeah.
It's hard to start that conversation if it's already like, oh, okay, this person, Rachel's already not on board with what I'm doing. So how do I expect her to understand, or why, or how do I,
Yeah.
there's no reflection going on first, and it's already seen as a threat. So it makes starting that
Yeah.
conversation harder. And to your point, even just having that, meeting people where they are, is important, and you have to recognize where they are first.
Yes. And then and then there's more to it of trying to educate. Like what we have to really educate people. And it's hard. Like I remember there was somebody that I used to work with, and she had a family member, I forget what the relationship was, but somebody in her family who was an older person, clearly somebody who lived alone and was somewhat lonely, and they kept falling for romance scams,
Oh,
which is just sad.
on like the
And
dating
as much
websites and
as she
stuff.
explained it to this person, they just like, no, no, this guy, he's so nice, and he says these nice things about
Oh,
me,
like the
and
catfishing
he's
stuff
really
online where they're trying to get some intimate information, like a credit
yeah.
card number
Well,
and
well, they're
such.
not even trying to get information; they're trying to get money.
Yeah.
They like those romance scams will, they'll lure people into believing that they're in a relationship with them, and then they'll say, well, I want to come and see you, but oh, I just need help with a plane ticket or something, and
Mm.
they get tricked into sending money.
I
Um,
swear I watched one of those, like, either Netflix or HBO docs on that, or maybe, yeah, it was like a docu-series. Do you remember that coming out? I'm gonna want to plug it, but I can't even remember the name of it.
I don't. I might be interested in watching it though, because just for awareness about how, I mean, it's a classic social engineering attack.
Yeah. Maybe I'll try
So
to find it while we're even chatting. Anywho, on the on the entertainment aspect. It was
yeah.
interesting to watch and view, because in this series, it involved a very, like, this guy ended up targeting some pretty, like, he targeted the perfect population. Basically, it was young women between 25 and 35, established
Okay.
income, probably not from old money, but that were very independent, and had all their stuff together ahead of time, but that still
Yeah.
was looking for someone to share their lives with.
Yeah.
So he just played the cards exactly right for the expectations of the other person,
Yeah.
but also did it knowing that they would be more likely to fall for someone
Right.
who they can build trust with, as long knowing that they're probably not being targeted. They might be targeted for money if it was someone random and they're just being talked to online. But
Yeah.
he also advertised himself, that's right, as like a pre-existing billionaire. Like he was just scamming and playing
Oh,
along, like, oh, I
sure.
already have all this money. So when
Yeah.
the need for money came along, it was like, oh, like he texts these women. He's like, oh, I'm really, like, I'm strapped because like this account's locked up, and like I'm getting my admin on it. Like he made sure to play the I'm already rich card like really hard
Yeah.
first, and show them on like private jet planes. But it was like this Ponzi scheme of where he would take money from one woman trying to bridge fund like 10, 20,
Yeah.
$30,000, and then he would use that to pay for the the facade or the allure of him being at all these fancy places and these nice resorts.
Yeah.
But to your point, was interesting because it can happen to anyone. Like these women were all
Yeah.
educated, all had full-time jobs, all were pretty smart and intelligent people all around, but
Yeah.
anyone can be
And
manipulated
it's
in that way.
like the whole issue. It's not a, like, people think that it's up to the cybersecurity industry to protect
Mm.
against hackers, but when it comes to social engineering like that, there's nothing I can do to protect you. You just need to
It's the
use
weakest
your own
link.
common sense. And I remember I was working for an organization in kind of a dual role, but more cybersecurity than privacy. And we were having a series of attacks that, I'm sure it was the same attacker, but they were pretending to be the head person at this place that I worked, and they were reaching out and tricking people into believing that they were her, and then asking them to go and I don't know, buy gift cards. Like hackers always want gift cards because
Yeah.
it's a, we won't get into the details of that, but
Not in this
it's a
episode.
form of payment that they can use. Um, anyway, I got a hold of, oh, the reason I knew about this one particular victim was he made a mistake, and instead of responding to the attacker, he responded to the actual person, and she reached out to me and said, "This looks suspicious." So I called him on his phone, and I couldn't get him to believe that I was the real cybersecurity person at the place that he worked. And when I got a hold of him on his phone, he was actually at, I think it was at a Walgreens, going in to buy more gift cards because he had already bought some and sent them to this hacker. I hate to call them hackers, but
Yeah, so
anyway,
stereotypical.
he had already been victimized, and he didn't trust me. And like at that point, I was like, "There's nothing more I can do. If this white guy wants to give his money away, because it's not going to get reimbursed for him."
Yeah.
um, so I don't know. It's not a cybersecurity problem. It's a sociology problem. And I did at one point want to partner with psychologists at this university. Figuring that's the partnership. We need cybersecurity psychology to work together, but we didn't
Yeah.
have a venue for that
Yeah.
interaction at the time.
But the theme is like better training, better awareness for everyone.
Yeah,
But it's hard to guarantee the whole world has that. So like they say, like there's what is that old adage? Like a sucker's born every minute. Like
it's
it's
true.
kind of true here. Like you're in it. You need to protect yourself,
Yeah,
especially when there's so many other avenues that you can take to scam instead of stealing it right out of my pocket. You know.
right. Yeah.
I guess that leads us really nicely into like our own where we stand personally on our privacy risk threshold, or like where we are on the spectrum of, hey, I don't do any transactions online. I'm like completely undetectable, and I just blend in with the masses, all the way up to like what I was talking
Yeah.
about earlier, and folks saying they have nothing to hide, anyone can see anything, they don't care, which is false. But where do you rest on that? I guess.
So I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I have here. I'm sure you've seen this before in my office. Oh, I can't reach it. But anyway, this metal thing
Oh, your tin hat.
is my way of making fun of the people who think that need to wear a tinfoil hat to
Yeah.
stop whoever from listening to your brain waves or something. Um, so I'm not one of those people. That's just to make fun of them. It's not to really protect my brain. Um, but I think that I expect companies that I do business with to have reasonable privacy practices. I know what those reasonable practices are and what they should be, doing. And like I have red flags go off when like a company that doesn't need it is asking for my social security number, my date of birth. Like you don't need to know that for
Mm-hmm.
this business transaction that we have. But I don't think I'm overly protective of like non-sensitive personal information. Like you said, people of your generation, like this, I have nothing to hide. I do choose to post a lot of stuff about myself on social media. So if you want to know where I was on vacation, have at it. I don't really care if you know. I was in Colorado, by the way, for
Yeah.
vacation this year. Um,
Fun.
but also I feel pretty confident in the fact that I am familiar with the strategies that I guess attackers might use to try and gain access to my personal information, and then how they might use that in a negative way against me. So I feel somewhat protected by my own knowledge of the industry.
Mm-hmm.
So I know what to share, what not to share, who to not share it with, and I'm fairly confident when somebody is reaching out a social engineering attack against me. That's just not going to work because I have no interest in any of that, and
Yeah.
I just ignore them completely. So yeah, I think I'm somewhere in the middle.
Mm.
Where do you fall? Do you have a tinfoil hat also?
No, I'm pretending like I'm checking. No, I don't. But when I first started learning about privacy when I was in university, like it was pretty tempting to put that tinfoil hat on just because of how like laser focused that my program was on the big tech industry in general. Like I'm pretty sure a lot of the courses are like a complete one-to-one setup into the business models that companies like Google and Meta and Amazon, Apple use to take, the metadata and make something valuable off of it, and that being their whole, as of the last 20 years, being their business proposition.
Yeah.
It wasn't something I learned about in school more like clearly, but when I learned about like it was also around the time very closely that Cambridge Analytica was being talked about,
Sure.
and that put me on to a little bit after university put me on to Shoshana Zuboff's Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I actually listened to it as an audiobook, but it's a very lengthy book. it's a whopper. It's like the size of a Bible, but she goes into like ridiculously stringent detail about the phenomenon called surveillance capitalism.
Okay.
And it's basically this economics concept that recognizes that there's this widespread collection and commodification of personal data by corporations.
Yep.
And of course, when I like heard this term and I heard the work that she was doing, it wasn't a huge surprise to me because of my educational background. Like that was the stuff I was basically being taught how to do. And I could feel like I could do a whole episode on her work.
Yeah.
But I recognize, and part of why I lean into privacy is kind of this area to, work in and kind of exercise what I understand about this whole business model is just because corporations have now created like their whole revenue stream around picking up the metadata that we leave behind in our activities and our transactions and even behaviors that I can't even perceive as being discreted down to something valuable that anyone would want to buy from me, kind of in a data broker sense. Like they figured it out, and they figured out that you don't need to like exactly ask for what you need in the form of discrete data types. You can observe people's behavior through different,
Right.
if I'm messaging my friends, like how often am I messaging them? It's basically all the stuff that we don't think companies care about, but they can technically obtain through the background of their apps and their digital platforms, and monetizing it on a ridiculously high scale. In this book, Shoshana talks about how this was basically started by Google Ads work back in around 2003, where the tech bubble busted. They had like no other ways to monetize anymore, and they thought it was over. And they created the strategy of like, oh, well, we have all of the traffic and metadata about the people that visit the sites that we serve to them. Like, that's got to be really valuable for advertisers, right? And so they took what Zuboff calls this surplus of information, or like the exhaust of what we leave behind when we create these transactions and we move in this world, and packaged it up, monetized it, and sold it basically back to the companies that would be targeting us for their actual sales. So it inevitably becomes just as valuable as the sales themselves to guarantee a predicted outcome based on the information that you already have. You have to do basically no extra work for, except for figuring out how to comb it and clean it up to make it valuable to these bidders or these brokers. Going back all the way around to where I fall on the spectrum of privacy, that realization, that conversation kind of pushed me further toward maybe the tin hat side, if I'll be honest. But that is really out of a world of curiosity, because I think it's incredibly fascinating that our whole economy is being flipped upside down by the digital age, because what she explains, and this is really interesting, in capitalism, you try to find new resources to basically flip and sell as part of your value add or your statement. She's like, we ran out of land, we ran out of resources, we ran out of ways to make money, essentially. But then the digital economy came along and said, hey, look, you have all of this surplus information that you can use and create value out of. So I think as an economy, we leaned into that super hard, and you can tell based on the second, up and wave of the technology sector following the early 2000s. And we go through booms and cycles all the time for various reasons, but it stayed pretty strong for that I think design and how we actually how the economy actually works as a result of digital technology. So being aware of that, it's sometimes like, okay, I know a little bit too much now to just have fun everywhere. So it definitely influences my behavior. But in the same end, I'm like, these tools are great. These social media tools, even, like, I connect with friends that I haven't talked to in years or that are wildly far
Hmm.
away and just it's unfeasible for me to see them. But
Yeah.
I can keep up with them. I can message them like at the drop of a hat, basically. And other platforms allow me to essentially hang out with them and do things
Sure.
like this podcast without being physically in the same space. So
Yeah.
recognizing the fact that learning this stuff has influenced my behavior has also made me think, like why I know I'm being observed basically, and that's changing my behavior. Like, am I okay with that, or do I want to genuinely behave like myself and share what I would want to share,
Yeah.
knowing that I can trust these entities to do that? And so, being a privacy professional, I feel like I can, learn the ways to make that possible in a way, or at least communicate, what can allow people to feel safe versus what are reasonable
Yeah.
safeguards to put behind them.
And I guess it goes to that whole thing of the right to be left alone, but choosing that. Like I want to engage with a digitally connected world, and the fact that here we are doing these conversations together, we're a whole country apart. There,
Yeah.
we're 3 time zones away from each other, and we can do it seamlessly. It's awesome. So the fact that you were so interested in books like that when during your undergraduate studies, it's no surprise that you're working in the privacy field. So what's the next step? What was the leap from there to where you are now? How did you get into the field of privacy? And like, what are the things about it that excites you and motivates you in the work that you do?
Yeah. I went in a little bit on what motivates me, which is just like basically furthering the education piece for all
Yeah,
parties and for myself. Like a lot of what motivated me to stay in the field once and for example, like when I was an undergrad and even the first, couple of years of working, I didn't realize this was a field with jobs and other professionals, as
yeah,
silly and simple as that sounds. I came from an IT audit background, so it was just a matter of time before I found my way into a dedicated role in that area because certain aspects that they're not far off and they're definitely transitional skills that I was able to bring with me from that. But it's kept me there really for my own personal learning. Like I'm really blessed to have a job that forces me to learn about things I'm already interested in and that I can use to my own
yeah,
benefit. And then obviously talk about on shows like this or with my friends and family because it's it's niche, but it's relevant to everyone. And I know there are other fields like that, but this one just feels like it strikes that special balance of, okay, I can vary the amount of depth of information I can share depending on who I talk to because no one's going to tell me, oh yeah, I don't use smartphones or oh yeah, I don't. I mean, at least anyone, I'm sorry, I'm going to encounter, likely encounter, like it's very, very unlikely I'm going to hear that. So there are pieces
sure.
to the information that we learn and exchange that will be relevant to them as far as privacy goes. It's baked into our lives.
Yeah.
How about yourself, John? What got you into privacy in a more professional sense?
Well, I mean, the evolution for me was a lot longer because I'm so much older than you. But so when I started working in the tech industry a long time ago, and started off in just desktop tech support type roles, and evolved that into like designing distributed server based systems, and then managed infrastructure like centralized servers. For a couple of organizations, like managing server storage infrastructure, and evolved into an overall cybersecurity role. And didn't realize in the beginning that cybersecurity role really had a lot of privacy stuff to it. Even the organization that I worked for didn't even really recognize it as a privacy role, but it really was.
But you did.
And once I recognized that, I really kind of got more deeply involved with it because it was just interesting to me that because I think fundamentally privacy and cybersecurity is the same, but cybersecurity is more I don't know, a prescriptive approach to it.
It's oriented to more based on
But
the organization, right, and the threats that the organization might have to the assets they carry.
yeah,
Whereas
exactly. Yeah, so
privacy is
you're
kind of
protecting an
individual
organization.
oriented, right?
Yeah, but like I think privacy is fundamentally about protecting people, and I love the way so GDPR calls it that you're protecting the rights and privileges of natural humans,
Mm-hmm.
and they specifically separate that. You're not protecting corporations here; you're protecting individual people,
Yeah.
and I love that. That resonates with me of working in a field where we're protecting people, and we might be doing it for corporations. So that that's who our employers are. But I think the beneficiaries of our work are those natural humans, like people who just live and interact in the world are the people that we're protecting. And I think I like it that it's complex. Like we're not. Some people think that privacy is about locking things down or keeping all of my information in a box. Well, it's really not, because we need to facilitate people being able to operate in this digital interconnected world, but in a safe and secure way, and in ways that they have some agency over themselves and what's happening with their data. And it's a really fine line to achieve that, of allowing people to operate in an interconnected world but still be secured. The other part about it is I really believe that privacy is in its infancy, and we're kind of trying to figure it out as we go. And you and I have talked before about that privacy evolves as technology does. Well, technology is growing so quickly and so fast right now with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I think that as a field of privacy practitioners, we're really kind of making the rules that are going to be out there for decades, maybe even generations to come.
Hmm.
And it's really cool to be like a pioneer in an industry. And there's people that are going to live, long after I'm gone, who I hope are benefiting from some of the work that you and I are doing here today, which is cool. That's cool. It resonates with me.
Yeah. And that just like the technology changing over time, like the education has to too. So
Yeah.
this being a new phenomenon, it's not going to die out because we covered all of the edges of stuff that people use today and all the concerns around it. It'll change because we'll always be exchanging information in order to facilitate our economy at this point.
Yeah.
We always did. It's just the how fast it can occur, how much data we can actually combine and use to serve other
Right.
purposes is so much more. It's practically unlimited than what you looked at even 20, 25 years ago.
It's true.
Had to clear
I
my throat
never
there
would
for a
have
sec.
predicted that we would get to where we are
No,
today.
and
And
that's part of the exciting thing. Like
yeah,
I can say we're at a very cutting edge end of a cultural shift. We're
yeah,
finally recognizing that, okay, like we know the powers that are being, we can talk about them, and we can work together to create some safe solutions that again still encourage sharing of what I want to share, because that's a human instinct. Like I like to feel
yeah,
connected with other people, and it's important to maintain that in order to not fall into actual isolation for the fear of not being able to
right.
maintain your privacy. I also am kind of interested to see what happens in the next 15, 20 years with these attitudes, stemming from my generation being the ones, at least anecdotally, that are the most on the side of, oh, I have nothing to hide. Everyone has
Yeah.
everything they could want to know about me, or if they don't, they can figure out how to get it. I remember hearing a talk from Glenn Greenwald, who was the reporter that covered the Snowden leaks around
Okay.
2014,
Yep.
and he's written a book about his experiences. He's done TED Talks, but in this talk, he challenged that sentiment, and I love the analogy he used. He's like, they're likely to say you have nothing to hide, but the one exercise I like to do is ask if I can have their phone password, and if I can keep their phone and
Sure.
go in a room for an hour and do whatever I want with it. Like anyone that says
Yeah.
that, I'm gonna expect is going to say no, even down to people like your spouses or family members. Like there certainly are
Yeah.
things that people want to hide. Whether or not they think about that immediately is kind of just back to that natural defense mechanism I was talking about earlier with like, oh, I don't
Yeah.
want to change my behaviors, or I'm almost too afraid to open that Pandora's box to begin. So I'm just going to say I don't care at all. But
Yeah.
in reality, it's more so a matter of time where you experience that one event, or you learn a bit more about how creepy this this world can be with how information is shared and who has access to it, and
Yeah.
you start to take more precautions. But the worst thing is to be retroactive as an individual, because like we've said throughout this talk, it's really a lot of the stuff is, of course, down to corporations and the government, to help be more
Sure.
aware of our preferences. But it comes down to us as kind of the defender of our own rights to the information that we do want to share and what we don't, and leveraging all the controls we have at our
Yeah.
disposal to make sure that we're comfortable with it.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I'm excited to be a part of the industry that's there protecting it, and love doing this podcast with you, because it's actually quite thought provoking for me. Because some of these questions we've talked about, I really wouldn't have put as much thought into them, except for the fact that I needed to get ready for this chat with you. So thanks for the opportunity to do it, and hopefully in our own small way we can help to educate people a little bit. I don't know how we draw an audience. Like when you say that there's a podcast about privacy, I don't know that people are going to say, "Oh, that sounds awesome."
Yeah.
So we'll see how it
We'll
goes.
figure
But I
out a way to
appreciate
sell
the
it.
chat.
I do love these chats too, and I agree too on that. With all these questions, I feel like I always have an answer, but
Yeah,
they come out in more random circumstances, or when they're provoked and asked. And I'm not personally always asked about these things. It's just assumed
yeah,
being in the field. So that's awesome. With that,
it is.
we'll call it a wrap. Any last words?
No, that's it. That was a call it a wrap. I'm looking forward to. We've already got ideas for upcoming episodes, so we'll just stay tuned.
We'll tell you if your fridge is in fact listening to you.
Is your refrigerator spying on you? Yeah, I've started doing some research on that,
Who
so we'll
knows
see
if
where it
it'll be a
goes.
yes or no answer? It might be one of those
It's not.
nebulous
It's not going to be
maybes.
that
Depends.
simple. So maybe tune in.
Awesome. Till next time. See ya.
See ya.